June 12th, 1978. The air in Blackwater Creek, Tennessee was something you wore. Lily Morgan felt its weight on her shoulders as she sat across the polished oak table from her father, Thomas. The air in his house was different, scrubbed clean of the county's humid embrace by sheer will and the faint, ever-present scent of lemon oil and old wood. It smelled of order, of success. She was 22 years old, with hands that were already learning the language of hard work, but they looked pale and uncertain resting on the table now. Between them lay a slim leather-bound ledger. It was new. The spine had not yet been properly broken. Thomas Morgan looked at the ledger, then at his daughter. He was a man carved from the very soil he commanded, his face a roadmap of dry seasons and good harvests. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a steady, unwavering light that could be mistaken for judgment, but was really just a profound and immovable certainty. He had built a life, a significant one, from 300 acres of prime bottomland. He grew soybeans and corn, and his methods were as reliable as the sunrise. He expected his only child to follow the path he had so meticulously cleared. 92 acres, he said. His voice was low, with the gravel of the creek bed in it. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, and the fact was absurd. "Yes, sir," Lily answered, her own voice quieter than she wanted it to be. The parcel west of Miller's Ridge, the one the county's been trying to sell for a decade. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning in protest. The sound was familiar, a part of the house's own language. "There's a reason they can't sell it, Lily. It's a vertical mess of gullies and rocks, and it's been swallowed whole by that purple vine. Wisteria. It's a plague. Strangles everything it touches. You can't run a furrow on it, can't graze a single head of cattle. It's worthless." She did not flinch. She had practiced this conversation in her head for weeks, standing in her small room, staring at her own reflection until the words felt less like a plea and more like a plan. "I don't want to run a furrow," she said, her gaze steady on his, "and I don't need cattle." He waited. Thomas Morgan was a patient man. He could wait for a seed to sprout, for a cloud to break, for a stubborn child to see reason. Lily slid the ledger forward, an inch, a small, decisive push across the polished wood. "I want to raise bees." The silence that followed was dense. It was not an angry silence, not yet. It was a silence of profound incomprehension. He had taught her to read the land, to understand the alchemy of soil and rain and sun. He had given her a world of tangible things, the heft of a ripe tomato, the smell of freshly turned earth, the solid logic of crop rotation, and she was talking about insects, about a flower that was a weed. "Bees," he repeated. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. "Wisteria," she explained, leaning forward just a little, the earnestness she tried to suppress now coloring her tone. "Everyone sees it as a problem, a blight. But Daddy, it's a miracle. It flowers in mid-spring, a massive bloom, right when the colonies are building up from winter. It's loaded with nectar. The pollen is rich in protein. It's a perfect food source, a whole 92-acre buffet, hanging right there in the air." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and for a moment, he did not see a farmer's daughter. He saw a stranger, someone who spoke a different language of the land. "You want to take the loan I offered you, a loan to secure your future on this farm, and buy 92 acres of weeds to feed bugs." "I want to take the loan and build a business," she corrected him, gently but firmly. "I've done the math." She tapped the pristine ledger. "It's all in here. The cost of the hives, the extractor, the jars, the market price for honey. The yield I can expect per hive per acre." He didn't look at the book. Looking at the book would be a concession. It would mean admitting this fantasy had been given the dignity of numbers. "Your future is here. This land. It'll be yours. You just have to learn it. My way. I love this farm," she said, and it was the honest truth. "I love what you've built, but it's yours. I want to build something that's mine." She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. He stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. He saw his wife in the set of her jaw. His wife had been a woman of quiet, unshakable convictions. It was a trait he had admired in her and found baffling in his own daughter. He had always believed strength was in the tilling, the planting, the tangible. Lily was looking for it in the air, in the flight of a tiny winged creature. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. "The loan stands. The terms are the same, 5%. First payment due in a year. But if you fail, you come home. You work this land, the way it's meant to be worked. No more talk of bees." A wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy washed over Lily. She had not realized she'd been holding her breath. "Thank you, Daddy." He just grunted, his gaze shifting to the window, to his fields stretching out in perfect, orderly lines. He had given her the rope. Whether she used it to pull herself up or to hang herself remained to be seen. He thought he knew the answer. 2 days later, Lily stood in the musty office of the county clerk. The room smelled of old paper and dust. Mr. Harris, a man whose frame seemed to be slowly collapsing into his chair, peered at her over his spectacles. "You're Thomas Morgan's girl, aren't you?" he asked, shuffling through a stack of deeds. "Yes, sir. Lily Morgan." "And you're sure about this? The Wisteria parcel?" He said wisteria like it was a contagion. "We've had that on the books since before I started working here. Nobody's ever put in a serious offer." "I'm serious," Lily said, placing the cashier's check on the counter. Mr. Harris stared at the check and then back at her. He had the look of a man witnessing a perfectly healthy person, willingly stepping off a cliff. He sighed, the sound of bureaucratic resignation. He stamped the papers with a heavy final thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room. It was the sound of ownership. An hour later, she was there. She parked her father's old Ford truck, the one he'd begrudgingly lent her at the edge of the property line. The road was barely a suggestion of gravel and dirt. Before her, the land fell and rose in sharp, difficult inclines. And it was purple. It was not just patches of purple. The entire landscape was draped in it. Wisteria vines, thick as a man's arm, coiled around the trunks of oaks and hickories, their weight pulling the branches down into weeping arches. The cascades of flowers hung in dense, fragrant curtains, obscuring the true shape of the land beneath. It was a wild, untamable place, a catastrophe of botany, as her father would say. Lily got out of the truck. The air was thick with the sweet, cloying scent of the blossoms and alive with the sound she had been dreaming of for months. It was a low, vibrational hum, a million tiny engines working in unison. She smiled. It was the first genuine, untroubled smile she'd had in weeks. Everyone saw a plague. She saw a pantry. And it was all hers. The first weeks were brutal. The wisteria, for all its beauty, was a formidable opponent. She didn't want to destroy it, merely to manage it. She needed to carve out clearings, level spaces for the hives where they would get the morning sun and be protected from the worst of the wind. She used a handsaw and a pair of heavy-duty loppers, her hands quickly blistering, then callousing. She cleared a space for the small used travel trailer she'd bought with the last of her savings. It was her home now, a tiny silver box amidst a sea of green and purple. Every evening she would sit on its metal steps, eating a can of beans, her muscles screaming with a satisfying ache. She would watch the sun set, listening to the hum of the bees fade as they returned to their wild hives, and she would feel a sense of peace that had always eluded her in the perfect, polished order of her father's house. Her nearest neighbors were the Pritchards, a half-mile down the road. Dale Pritchard would sometimes slow his tractor as he passed, his face a mask of polite confusion. His wife, Mary, would wave from their porch. They were good people, but their curiosity was a palpable thing. One afternoon, Mary walked up the road carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Brought you some cornbread," she said, handing it to Lily. "Figured you might be tired of your own cooking." "That's mighty kind of you, Mary. Thank you." Lily was filthy, her hair tied back in a messy knot, a streak of dirt across her cheek. Mary's eyes scanned the clearing Lily had made, the stacks of unassembled hive boxes waiting like a strange geometric sculpture. "Dale and I, well, we were just wondering what a young thing like you was planning to do with all this. This," she gestured to the wall of wisteria. "I'm starting a honey farm," Lily said simply. Mary blinked. "Honey? From that? That's the plan." Mary looked from Lily to the oppressive jungle of vines and back again. She was a practical woman. She understood chickens and vegetable gardens and canning. This was something else entirely. "Well," she said, drawing the word out. "Good luck to you, dear." It was said with the kind of gentle pity reserved for the sweetly delusional. The first shipment of bees arrived on a flatbed truck from Georgia. 200 packages, each a buzzing, vibrating box of life. The driver, a leathery man with a cheerful disposition, helped her unload them. "Never delivered this many to a place that wasn't a proper orchard," he commented, wiping sweat from his brow. "What are you growing here, miss?" "Wisteria," Lily said. The man laughed. "No, I mean, what are your bees going to be feeding on?" "The wisteria." His laughter died. He looked around, his cheerful expression replaced by the same familiar look of bafflement she was coming to know so well. "Right," he said, and got back in his truck with a new urgency. That evening, as twilight settled, Lily performed the delicate ritual of installing the colonies. She opened each package, gently shaking the mass of bees into their new home. A clean, new hive box. She located the small cage holding the queen and placed it carefully between the frames. The air filled with the roar of thousands of disoriented bees, a chaotic, angry sound. But Lily was calm. She moved slowly, deliberately. This was the first real step. This was the moment her theory began to take physical form. A week later, her father's truck appeared. It didn't turn up her path. It just slowed to a stop on the main road, idling for a long moment. Lily was 100 yards away, checking one of the new hives. She saw the truck, the familiar silhouette of her father behind the wheel. He was just a shape, a presence. He didn't get out. He didn't wave. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, the truck pulled away and continued down the road. She straightened up, a small smile touching her lips. He was checking on her. It was not an offer of help, nor was it a visit. It was an act of observation. He was watching, waiting. She wasn't going to fail. Back at the Morgan farmstead, Thomas sat at his dinner table. The house was too quiet. It had been quiet since his wife passed, but now Lily's absence had created a new, sharper kind of silence. He ate his meal, which he had cooked himself. It was serviceable. Nothing more. He thought about her. He saw her in his mind's eye, a small, stubborn figure against that riot of purple. He had been so sure she would be back within a month, tail between her legs, the wild dream burned out of her by the sheer, overwhelming reality of that worthless piece of land. But she wasn't. He remembered her as a little girl, not more than 6 or 7, sitting for an hour in his clover field, perfectly still, just to watch the bees work. She had never been afraid of them. She had always been fascinated, pointing out how they moved, how they chose one flower over another. He had seen it as a childish curiosity, a distraction from the real work of the farm. Now, he wondered. He got up and walked to his office. He pulled out his own ledger, the one that chronicled 30 years of profit and loss, of struggle and success. It was a book of straight lines, of predictable cycles, of tangible assets, soybeans, corn, machinery, land that could be plowed. He ran his hand over the worn cover. His world was built on a foundation of undeniable fact. What was hers built on? The flight of an insect, a hunch. It was foolish. It was brave. The thought surprised him. He pushed it away. The loan payment was due in 10 months. The numbers would tell the story in the end. The numbers never lied. The summer passed into a warm, lingering autumn. Lily's days fell into a rhythm. Mornings were spent with the hives, checking the queens, monitoring for mites, ensuring the colonies were strong and healthy. The bees were thriving. The wisteria had faded, but the hills were rich with late-season goldenrod and aster, and the bees worked it with a relentless energy. The hives grew heavy with stored honey. She did not touch that honey. It was their winter store. Her own survival depended on theirs. Winter was mild, a blessing she hadn't dared to ask for. The cold snaps were brief, the snow light. In her small trailer, warmed by a propane heater, she spent the evenings reading. She read every book she could find on beekeeping, on honey production, on botany. She made notes in her ledger, refining her plans for the spring. The numbers were still just projections, but they felt more real now. They felt possible. She made her trips into town for supplies once a week. The conversations at the general store had changed. The pity had been replaced by a kind of grudging curiosity. "Heard you made it through the winter out there," said Mr. Thompson, the owner, as he rang up her purchase of flour and coffee. "We did all right," Lily said. "Saw your father the other day," he continued, bagging her goods. "Asked him how your project was coming along." Lily braced herself. What did he say? He just said, "The girl's still working." That's all. But the way he said it, Mr. Thompson paused, looking at her over the top of his glasses. "That man of yours is either a fool or a genius. Ain't no in-between with a plan like that." He had said it to her father, and now he was saying it to her. Lily felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. It was the closest thing to a compliment she had received from the outside world. "I guess we'll find out come spring," she said. Spring did not just arrive. It exploded. One week, the wisteria vines were bare, skeletal claws gripping the trees. The next, they were covered in fat velvet buds. And then, almost overnight, the 92 acres erupted in a silent, fragrant detonation of color. The hills and hollows were transformed into a rolling sea of purple. It was breathtaking. It was more than she had even imagined. The air, for a half-mile in every direction, was heavy with the perfume. And the sound returned. The hum. But it was different this time. It was not the gentle hum of summer foraging. This was a roar. Her 200 hives, having come through the winter strong and populous, descended on the blossoms with a ravenous, single-minded purpose. Lily stood on the porch of her trailer and watched them. She saw streams of bees, flying in straight, determined lines from the hives to the nearest curtains of flowers. She saw them returning, their legs so heavy with bright yellow pollen they could barely fly. This was the moment, the catalyst. Her entire venture, the loan, her father's disapproval, the town's skepticism. It all came down to this, the alchemy between this invasive vine and her tiny, tireless livestock. She went to her hives and put on the honey supers, the extra boxes for the bees to store the surplus nectar. She put on 2. A week later, she added a 3rd to each hive, then a 4th. The bees were not just making honey. They were building an empire of it. The harvest was the hardest work she had ever known. For 3 weeks, she worked from sunrise to sunset. The honey supers were heavy, each one weighing 60 pounds or more. She hauled them from the apiaries to her trailer, her arms and back burning with the strain. Inside the trailer, she had set up her small, hand-cranked extractor. The space was cramped and sticky. The air was so saturated with the smell of warm wax and honey, it was almost hard to breathe. She would uncap the frames with a hot knife, the wax peeling away to reveal the perfectly sealed golden liquid beneath. She would place the frames in the extractor and turn the crank, the centrifugal force pulling the honey out where it would run down the sides and collect at the bottom. The honey was beautiful. It was a pale, almost translucent gold, with a delicate floral taste unlike any other honey she had ever known. It tasted of sunshine, and of purple flowers, and of a wild, untamed place. Day after day, she filled 5-gallon buckets with the liquid gold. They lined the walls of her trailer, a testament to the impossible abundance of the land. She had done it. Her theory was no longer a theory. It was a fact, sitting in buckets, waiting to be bottled. When the last frame was extracted, she cleaned herself up. She put on a clean shirt. She took one of the first jars of honey she had bottled, its label neatly written by hand, Blackwater Creek honey, pure wisteria. And she took her ledger. She drove the old Ford truck not to her father's house, but to his main barn. She knew he would be there. It was late afternoon, the time he always set aside for mending equipment. The big doors were open, and she saw him inside, sitting on a low stool, a piece of harness leather across his lap, a needle and awl in his hands. He looked up as her shadow fell across the doorway. He did not seem surprised to see her. He simply stopped his work and waited. She walked across the dusty floor, the smell of hay and leather and old machinery wrapping around her. She did not say a word. She placed the jar of honey on a workbench beside him. Then she placed the ledger next to it, open to a fresh page. On the page were columns of neat, careful figures. The total yield in pounds, the number of jars filled, the initial sales she'd made to a small grocer in the next town over who had been intrigued by the story, the projected revenue for the full harvest, and at the bottom a calculation for the first payment on her loan, the principal plus 5% interest. Tucked into the book was a check made out to Thomas Morgan. "It's a good start," she said, her voice steady. He looked at the jar of honey, its pale gold catching the afternoon light. He looked at the ledger, at the clean, undeniable certainty of the numbers. His eyes lingered on her handwriting, as neat and determined as she was. He didn't look at the check. Slowly he put down his tools. He picked up the jar, unscrewed the lid. He dipped his little finger, a finger calloused and stained from a lifetime of work, into the honey. He brought it to his lips and tasted it. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of something that looked like surprise or respect. He looked from the honey to the ledger, and then, finally, to his daughter. He saw the faint smudges of dirt that still clung to her hands, He saw the exhaustion and the triumph in her eyes. "This is good honey," he said. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. He looked at the check nestled in the ledger. He reached out, but not to take it. He gently closed the book, pushing it back toward her. "Pay me at the end of the year," he said, his voice quiet. "All at once." It was not a demand. It was a statement of faith. It was his admission that her gamble was not a gamble at all. It was a plan, and it was working. Lily felt the tension she had carried for a year dissolve. She simply nodded, unable to speak. She picked up the ledger and the honey and turned to leave. "Lily," he said. She stopped and turned back. "Your mother would have liked this honey," he said, and then he picked up his harness and went back to his work. The success of the wisteria honey was quiet, then sudden. Lily designed a proper label, a simple, elegant drawing of a wisteria blossom. She sold her entire first year's harvest before the leaves even turned for autumn. The small grocer in the next town became her biggest advocate. Word spread. A columnist from a Nashville paper drove out and wrote a story about the wisteria witch of Blackwater Creek, the girl who had turned a plague into a profit. The article was slightly sensational, but it brought attention. Orders came in from restaurants in Nashville, from specialty shops in Atlanta. The name Blackwater Creek honey began to mean something. It meant something unique, something born of a wild and unlikely place. Lily invested every dollar back into the business. She bought a larger motorized extractor. She built a dedicated honey house, a small, clean building for processing and bottling. She expanded her apiaries, splitting her strongest hives, carefully breeding queens from her best stock. The 92 acres became a finely tuned engine of production, a partnership between her own hard work and the tireless labor of her bees. The townspeople watched her old truck, now replaced with a newer, more reliable one, drive back and forth, loaded with supplies or jars of honey. The looks of pity were long gone. Now they looked with a kind of reserved awe. She had seen something they had all missed. She had looked at a thing they considered worthless and had seen its hidden heart. At the end of the year, almost to the day of her first meeting at the oak table, she drove to her father's house. This time, she went to the front door. He let her in, and they sat at the same kitchen table. It was laden not with tension but with the comfortable quiet that now existed between them. She placed a single envelope on the table. He opened it. Inside was a check. It was for the full amount of the loan plus the 5% interest, calculated to the penny. He looked at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'm buying the Pritchard place," he said, looking out the window. "Dale's retiring. Moving to Florida. I thought I'd put it in corn." "That's good land," Lily said. "It is," he agreed. A pause. "They asked me what you were going to do when all that wisteria of yours finally died off." Lily smiled. "Wisteria doesn't die off, Daddy. That's the whole point." He almost smiled back. "I told them you'd probably figure out a way to sell the roots." It was his version of a joke. It was his version of saying he was proud. 5 years later, in the spring of 1983, the wisteria was in full, glorious bloom. The air hummed with the familiar roar of millions of bees. On the porch of a small, neat house that now stood in the main clearing, Lily sat in a rocking chair, a cup of coffee in her hands. The house was solid, built from timber cleared from her own land. It felt like it had always been there. A screen door creaked open and a man came out carrying another cup of coffee. He was a quiet, steady man, a teacher from the next town over who had been captivated first by her honey and then by her. He handed her the cup and sat in the chair beside her, their silence comfortable and deep. In the yard, two small children, a boy with his father's quiet eyes and a girl with her mother's determined set of jaw, were trying to catch grasshoppers in a jar. A familiar truck rumbled up the drive. Thomas Morgan, his hair now more silver than brown, climbed out. He moved a little slower, but his back was still straight. "Grandpa!" the little girl shouted, running to him. He lifted her up easily, settling her on his hip. He walked over to the porch. He did not come with advice or pronouncements anymore. He came to see his grandchildren. He came to sit for a while in the world his daughter had built. He nodded at Lily and at her husband, Mark. He took the chair they offered him, his granddaughter still perched on his lap. His gaze went out over the landscape, over the impossible rolling waves of purple. The sight was still astonishing. "Still can't believe the county couldn't give this land away," he said, his voice softer now than it used to be. Lily looked out at the view, at the source of her life's work, at the beautiful, stubborn, invasive plant that had given her everything. "Their loss," she said, a smile touching her lips. "My gain." He nodded, a slow, thoughtful motion. He looked at his granddaughter, then at his daughter, then at the humming, vibrant land. He finally understood. Some things of value could not be plowed or planted. Some things of value simply had to be seen for what they were, and his daughter had always been able to see.